For most of us, a life of secrecy and evasion seems like something out of a thriller movie. But for one man, this was his reality for an astounding 15 years. Imagine for a moment living every single day knowing that the world around you is constantly looking for you. You live in the shadows, hiding in plain sight, blending in, pretending to be someone else. While the truth about your life is buried so deep that even your closest family members don't know the whole story. This isn't just a fictional character from a spy novel or a criminal on the run. This is the story of a man who was once a fugitive, living a life of constant fear until one fateful night, when the FBI knocked at his door. That was the night that changed everything. For 15 years, he had been evading the law, staying off the radar, but eventually, even the shadows weren't enough to protect him. Our story begins with a man who, by all accounts, had everything to lose. He wasn't an international criminal mastermind, nor was he involved in any violent acts. His crime? It was a financial one, but one that carried such weight that it would alter the course of his life forever. The man in question had been involved in one of the most significant financial frauds of his time, and the authorities were closing in. He had made his escape, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of chaos in his wake. The authorities were desperate to catch him, but for years, they had no leads. No fingerprints, no sightings, no trace of him in any database. As far as they were concerned, he had simply disappeared into thin air. And for the man, this disappearance was not just an escape. It was a survival tactic. Every day was a game of cat and mouse where the stakes were his freedom and his life. As the years went by, the fugitive's life became a series of calculated decisions, each one designed to keep him one step ahead of the authorities. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. He moved constantly, changing his name, his appearance, and even his personality. He became a ghost, slipping through society unnoticed. In the beginning, it was a thrilling game, but as time went on, the weight of his actions began to take its toll. The constant fear of being discovered started to erode his mental and emotional stability. He could never let his guard down. There were no close friends, no relationships that lasted longer than a few months. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. He lived in constant isolation, hiding from the world and the consequences of his past actions. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, every siren in the distance filled him with dread. But then came that one night, the night when everything changed. At midnight, as he sat in the dimly lit apartment he had called home for the last few months, he heard a knock at the door. At first, he thought it was just a random knock, the kind he had grown used to dismissing. But something about this time was different. The knock was firm, urgent. His heart raced as he approached the door, a feeling of dread creeping up his spine. His mind raced through all the possibilities, but none of them prepared him for what happened next. He opened the door, only to be greeted by a team of FBI agents standing on his doorstep. They had found him. After 15 years of evading capture, the man who thought he had outrun his past was finally face to face with the consequences of his actions. The life he had carefully crafted in the shadows was over. In that moment, everything he had built, his false identities, his hidden life, came crashing down. As the agents took him into custody, the fugitive was left to reflect on his life. What had once seemed like an escape, a chance at freedom, had now turned into a prison of his own making. In those 15 years, he had never truly lived. He had only existed, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering when his past would catch up to him. The moment the FBI knocked on his door marked the end of a long and exhausting chapter of his life. But it also marked the beginning of a new one. The man who had once lived in the shadows, always running, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The truth had finally caught up with him, and there was no hiding anymore. His story, a tale of evasion and fear, would soon be told to the world. The concept of living in the shadows might sound like the plot of a high-stakes action thriller. But for one man, it was his reality. For 15 years, he lived with the constant weight of fear and paranoia, never knowing when his past would come crashing back into his life. It wasn't a life of luxury, nor was it filled with excitement. It was a life built on secrecy, evasion, and a constant struggle to stay one step ahead of the law. Every day, he woke up with the knowledge that he had to remain invisible, hidden from a world that was desperately trying to find him. But how did he get to this point? What led him to live in the shadows for over a decade? This is the story of a man who at one point had it all, and then lost it all in an instant. In the early days of his life on the run, he wasn't thinking about the long-term consequences. He didn't think about the years that would pass or the isolation he would eventually feel. All he could think about was survival. He had been involved in one of the most significant financial frauds of his time, and when the authorities caught wind of it, they came after him with a vengeance. His crime, though not violent, was devastating in its reach. The money that had been stolen wasn't just a few dollars, it was millions. And the impact it had on countless people was far-reaching. The authorities knew that catching him was a priority, and they were determined to find him. But finding him was no easy task. He was a master of evasion, a man who knew how to cover his tracks. He understood the game he was playing. He knew that every move he made had to be calculated. Every decision had to be precise. At first, he stayed within the country, moving from city to city, never staying in one place for too long. He changed his appearance, altered his behavior, and adopted new identities. But as the years passed, the situation grew more complicated. The financial system, which had been the source of his downfall, was now a tool he could use to hide. Fake documents, false names, and creative solutions to staying off the radar became part of his daily routine. But even with all the planning and preparation, living a life like that came with consequences. The man began to feel the strain of the constant fear. He was living a double life, and even the people closest to him didn't know who he really was. There were no friends, no lasting relationships. His connections were fleeting, just like the lives he created. Trust became a luxury he couldn't afford. If he let anyone get too close, he risked exposure. So he kept to himself, moving through life like a shadow, always cautious, always wary of the next step. The price of this lifestyle was high: loneliness, anxiety, and a constant sense of unease. The years passed, and the fugitive's life became a routine, a predictable cycle of hiding and running. Each day was a reminder that the past would eventually catch up with him, but he pushed the thought aside. The adrenaline of living in constant danger had once been thrilling, but as time went on, it began to lose its appeal. What had once been a game, a thrilling chase, turned into a never-ending series of small adjustments, tweaks to his life in an attempt to stay hidden. He had to be careful about his movements, careful about the people he encountered, careful about everything. His days were spent in places no one would think to look: run-down apartments, cheap motels, and even hiding in plain sight in major cities where no one cared to notice a face in the crowd. He had learned how to blend in, how to be invisible in a world that was constantly watching. But despite his best efforts, he knew that the law would never forget about him. The authorities were relentless, and the people affected by his crime were still out there, waiting for justice. He had managed to keep his distance for years, but every so often, the fear would rise up again. A knock at the door, a car parked too long outside his window. A glance from a stranger each moment was a reminder that the life he had built was fragile. Every time he moved to a new location, there was a sense of relief, but it was always temporary. He was always waiting for the inevitable. The weight of this lifestyle began to take its toll. While on the surface, he appeared to be living a life of freedom. He knew better than anyone that he was a prisoner of his own, making he couldn't relax, couldn't settle. It was exhausting. His mind was constantly racing, filled with thoughts of what could go wrong, of the day the authorities would find him. His anxiety grew to the point where he couldn't even remember the last time he had felt truly at ease. Every interaction with someone new was a risk, a gamble that he was growing increasingly unwilling to take. He had become a ghost, someone who could never truly live, only exist. Despite the fear, there was also a sense of pride in his ability to outsmart the system. He had done it. He had vanished. And for 15 years, he remained undetected. But no matter how carefully he planned, no matter how many precautions he took, there was always the knowledge that his luck could run out. It was only a matter of time before someone would find him, before the FBI would knock on his door. And when that day came, nothing he had done would matter. All the years of evasion would come to an end in an instant. Then, one night, it happened. The knock at the door, at first, he didn't think much of it. It was late midnight. To be exact, he had just settled into his routine for the evening. The familiar hum of the city outside his window was a constant, a reminder that the world was still turning, that life was going on as usual. But then came the knock again, louder this time, more insistent. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. He stood frozen, his mind racing through all the possible scenarios. Could it be the authorities? Had they finally tracked him down? Was this the end? He walked cautiously to the door, his every step calculated, as he peered through the peephole. His worst fears were confirmed. A group of FBI agents stood outside. It wasn't a mistake. They had found him. After 15 years of evading capture, the man who had lived in the shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The game was over. His past had come back to haunt him, and there was no escape. This time, opening the door was a surreal moment. For all those years, he had lived in constant fear of this moment. And now that it was happening, he couldn't quite believe it. The FBI agents, with their calm, professional demeanor, didn't give him a chance to speak. They moved swiftly, taking control of the situation. The man, now resigned to his fate, had no choice but to comply. The life he had so carefully constructed was unraveling before his eyes. As the agents took him into custody, the man's mind raced. He had known this day would come, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was the culmination of a lifetime of decisions, of choices, that had led him to this point. For all those years, he had lived in the shadows, hiding from the world, trying to outrun his past. But now, his past had caught up with him, and there was no place left to run. The FBI agents were efficient, processing him quickly and methodically. There were no words of comfort, no sympathy. It was just business, a job to be done. As he was driven away in the back of an unmarked car, the man couldn't help but think about the life he had lost. In all those years of running, he had never truly lived. He had only existed, and now it was all over. But as the car made its way through the city, he began to reflect on the choices he had made. Could he have done things differently? Could he have chosen a different path? One that didn't lead to a life in the shadows he would never know. All he could do now was face the consequences of his actions. The man was taken into custody, but his story didn't end there. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be filled with legal battles, courtroom drama, and, ultimately, the unraveling of the life he had tried so hard to hide. The world would now know who he was and what he had done. And as his story became public, the people who had been affected by his actions were finally able to get the closure they had been waiting for. For 15 years, he had lived in the shadows, always looking over his shoulder, always running. But in the end, there was nowhere left to hide. The FBI had found him, and his life in the shadows was over. Now he would have to face the consequences, and his story would serve as a reminder of the price of living a life of secrets and lies. The idea of escaping the consequences of one's actions for an extended period may seem like something out of a crime novel. Yet for this man, it was his tragic reality. For 15 long years, he lived with the weight of his past on his shoulders, never knowing when the law would finally catch up with him. The shadows he hid in were not a place of solace, but of constant fear and anticipation. His life was built on deception, secrecy, and evasion. And every day was a delicate balancing act, always walking the fine line between freedom and exposure. The world around him carried on as usual, unaware of the fugitive living among them. But how did he get here? What was the driving force behind his descent into hiding, and what events led him to remain in the shadows for so long? The man's crime was not born of violence, nor was it an act of passion. It was a financial fraud, the kind that had a ripple effect that reached far and wide. It started innocently enough. He was a young, ambitious man, eager to make his mark. But somewhere along the way, his moral compass failed him, and his decision to engage in an elaborate scheme led him down a path of ruin. The amount of money involved was staggering, far greater than he had ever anticipated. But when things began to fall apart, when the authorities were closing in on him, he made the choice to run. The rush of escape, the thrill of being one step ahead, was initially intoxicating. But soon, the reality of his actions began to set in. He wasn't just running from the law. He was running from everything he had built, from the life he once knew. The decision to flee came with a heavy price. It wasn't just a simple matter of leaving behind his home or his possessions. It was the disintegration of his entire identity. He had to vanish, to erase himself from the world entirely, changing his appearance, altering his identity, and moving from place to place were all essential elements of his new existence. But as time went on, the lines between who he truly was and who he had become began to blur. He could no longer remember what it felt like to be free from the fear that haunted him every moment of the day. He had learned to live in the shadows, but the shadows had begun to consume him. He couldn't trust anyone, not the people he met along the way, nor the strangers who crossed his path. Everyone was a potential threat, a possible link back to his past. He learned to be wary, to trust no one, and to keep his distance. In the process, he isolated himself completely. The life he had once known, with its relationships and social connections, was now a distant memory. He couldn't afford the luxury of a normal life. His existence was now confined to an endless cycle of hiding and moving, of looking over his shoulder, of constantly fearing the moment when his past would catch up to him. For the first few years, the man's escape felt like a victory. He had outsmarted the system, and the thrill of living on the edge kept him going. Every time he moved, every time he adopted a new identity, he felt as though he had won another round against the forces that sought to bring him down. But as the years wore on, the toll of this lifestyle began to show. What had once been an exhilarating chase turned into a soul-crushing routine. The man's world became smaller and smaller, his options more limited with each passing year. He couldn't go home, couldn't visit family, couldn't even form lasting friendships. His life was a constant series of temporary arrangements, short-term rentals, fake names, and careful, calculated steps to stay off the grid. Despite his best efforts, the man knew that he was not invincible. He had managed to avoid detection for over a decade, but with each passing day, the odds of being found grew higher. The FBI was relentless, and the investigation into his financial fraud had never stopped, while he had remained out of sight. The authorities had been working tirelessly to track him down. They followed every lead, pieced together every scrap of evidence, and slowly, the net began to tighten around him. But the fugitive had an advantage. He had been living on the edge for so long that he had become an expert at evading capture. He understood the game better than anyone. Despite his expertise, the cracks in his carefully constructed life began to show. The paranoia that had once been a subtle undercurrent grew stronger. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd set off alarms in his mind. His heart raced at the slightest sign that someone might be watching him. The thrill of evading capture had long since worn off, replaced by an ever-growing sense of anxiety. It wasn't just the fear of getting caught, it was the fear of losing everything. For all the freedom he thought he had gained by living in the shadows, he had lost so much more. His life had become a cage, and no matter how far he ran, there was no escaping the reality that he was always at risk of being found. But the worst part was the isolation. He had no one to turn to, no one who truly knew him. He had become a ghost, someone who existed but did not truly live. The relationships he had formed over the years were shallow, based on lies and false identities. He had no real connection to anyone. He couldn't afford to. Each time he moved, each time he changed his appearance, he left behind the remnants of the life he had created. It was as if he was constantly erasing himself, trying to outrun the man he once was. It was on one of those lonely nights, as he sat in his small apartment in yet another city, that everything changed. He had been living in this particular place for several months, his latest attempt at blending in with the crowd. But even in the safety of his new identity, he could never relax. He was always on edge, always watching the door, always listening for the sounds of someone coming to take him back to the life he had run from. Midnight came, and as he settled in for another night of anxious restlessness, there was a knock at the door. His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't heard. But the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. He stood frozen, unable to move. His mind raced. Who could it be? Could it be the authorities? Was this the end? The knock came again, and with it, a wave of panic washed over him. He slowly approached the door, peeking through the peephole. His worst fears were realized. Standing on the other side were FBI agents. He knew that he had been caught. All the years of evasion, all the careful planning, had been for nothing. The game was up. It was over. As he opened the door, the agents moved in quickly, taking control of the situation. They were efficient, precise professionals who had done this countless times before. There was no time for negotiation, no room for explanations. The man was placed under arrest, and just like that, his life in the shadows came to an abrupt end. The man who had spent 15 years running from his past, hiding in plain sight, was now face to face with the consequences of his actions. The door that had once been his sanctuary was now a symbol of his downfall. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: the weight of reality. The world he had carefully constructed around himself was crumbling. There was no more running, no more hiding. The FBI had found him, and there was no place left to go. As the agents took him into custody, the man's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. How had it all come to this? What had started as a calculated escape had ended in disaster. For 15 years, he had been able to slip through the cracks, but now he was paying the price. His life, his identity, his freedom, all of it had been built on lies. The man who had once thought he was invincible was now facing the harsh reality of his situation. As he was driven away in the back of an unmarked car, he couldn't help but think about the choices he had made. What if he had turned himself in sooner? What if he had chosen a different path? Could he have found redemption, or was this inevitable? These questions swirled in his mind, but they were questions with no answers. The moment the FBI knocked on his door, the life he had known was over. The man who had lived in the shadows for so long was now exposed to the world in the coming days. His story would be made public. The media would cover every aspect of his crime, his life on the run, and the eventual capture. For the first time, he would be forced to confront the consequences of his actions. His victims, those affected by the financial fraud, would finally see justice. And as for the man, he would have to face the long road ahead, the courtroom, the trial, and the inevitable punishment for his crimes. The man's story serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the price of living a life of deception and evasion. For 15 years, he lived in the shadows, always running, always hiding. But in the end, the truth always comes to light. The shadows can only protect you for so long. No matter how carefully you construct your life, no matter how far you run, the past will eventually catch up with you. For this man, his time in the shadows was over. The life he had built in secrecy was nothing more than an illusion. The consequences of his actions were now inescapable, and the world would soon know the truth. His story is one of evasion, fear, and ultimately, reckoning. In the end, he learned the hard way that you can run from your past, but you can never truly escape it. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about real-life escapes, mysteries, and shocking twists, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Also, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think he could have avoided all of this? Let's talk about it. See you in the next video.